Throughout history, a recurring pattern has consistently led to the downfall of every single global reserve currency. Not most of them, but absolutely all of them. First came the Portuguese real, which for 80 years reigned as the dominant currency in international trade before suddenly collapsing. Next was the Dutch guilder, influential for another 80 years before its decline. Then the British pound, which held sway for a full 105 years, only to eventually fade away. Each of these currencies followed the same predictable path through 7 distinct stages, convinced they were immune to the pattern, believing their currency was everlasting, only to be proven wrong in the end. In the modern era, the US dollar was established as the world's reserve currency in 1944, which was now over 81 years ago. As of 2025, the dollar is currently at stage 5 within this same 7-stage sequence. This is not some prophetic prediction. It is grounded in clear mathematical patterns. This sequence has played out 4 times over the course of 600 years, and the critical question is whether we are clever enough to recognize the signs or arrogant enough to think that this time is different. Let me explain what the 7 stages are and precisely where the dollar stands today. But before diving into each stage, it's essential to understand what exactly a reserve currency is. It's not solely about having a strong or stable currency. A reserve currency is the one that other nations hold in their central bank reserves. It's the currency used to price global commodities and the one in which international trade transactions are often denominated. When a country holds the reserve currency, that means every other nation depends on it. To purchase oil, they need the reserve currency. To settle trade deficits or surpluses, they rely on it. To hold safe assets like bonds, they must acquire the reserve currency. This situation grants what is known as exorbitant privilege, the ability to print currency and export it globally in exchange for real goods. Other nations are compelled to produce those goods to earn your currency, creating a kind of economic leverage. Because foreign countries need to accumulate your currency for reserves, you can sustain endless trade deficits, which means you import more than you export without immediate collapse. Additionally, you can borrow money at lower interest rates because the global demand for your bonds is structurally embedded, not just a matter of choice. Holding the reserve currency becomes the ultimate economic power, the weapon that empires have fought relentlessly to attain. Conversely, losing this status can lead to their collapse. Now, here are the 7 stages each reserve currency progresses through, and as I outline these, I will identify exactly where we are on this timeline. The first stage is military dominance coupled with control over key trade routes. Every reserve currency starts with overwhelming military strength that not only defends, but dominates critical channels of global commerce. They control these trade pathways, not solely through military power, but by asserting influence over the arteries that allow global trade to flow. In the 1500s, Portugal reached a remarkable milestone by mastering oceanic navigation. While other European nations were still confined to coastlines, Portuguese sailors were pioneering across vast open oceans. By 1688, they had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, opening pathways to Asia that did not rely on Ottoman-controlled land routes. Portugal militarized this advantage, establishing a formidable naval presence. Portuguese warships began to dominate the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Atlantic. They built fortified trading posts at strategic choke points, places like Goa, Malacca, Macau, Mozambique, and Beira, none of which were merely port cities. These were heavily armed fortresses, with cannons guarding entry and exit points, enabling Portugal to control who could trade in those waters and under what terms. This military control over vital trade routes established their currency, the real, as the currency of international commerce, not because it was backed by gold or economic supremacy, but because it was backed by superior naval firepower. In the 1500s, Portugal established itself as the dominant force in global trade by exercising strict military control over key routes. When merchants sought spices from the Malacca Strait, they had no choice but to deal with Portugal. To trade with India or bypass Portuguese authority, ships had to obtain permission, pay hefty fees, and often face tariffs or confiscation if they tried to circumvent the system. This militarized dominance over vital trade corridors elevated the Portuguese real to the status of the currency that truly mattered on the international stage, not because it was backed by gold or superior economic strength, but because it was backed by naval power and guns. The most powerful weapon in their arsenal was their naval fleet, which enforced their monopoly and controlled the flow of commerce. Merchants from Europe, Africa, and Asia relied heavily on the Portuguese real to conduct transactions within these controlled waters, transforming it into the currency of international trade. This happened not due to inherent economic superiority or backing by precious metals, but because Portuguese ships and cannons created a sphere of influence so formidable that trading partners had little choice but to accept their currency. The Dutch later adopted a similar approach in the 1600s. Their Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was much more than a trading enterprise. It was a military power in its own right. The VOC possessed its own navy and an army of around 20,000 soldiers, which enabled it to seize Portuguese trading posts, dominate the seas around the Spice Islands, and establish control over critical maritime routes. Amsterdam became the hub of global commerce, with Dutch ships traversing the Baltic, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean under their banner. If traders wished to do business, they needed to transact in guilders, the currency of the maritime empire that controlled the seas at the time. Moving into the 1800s, Britain perfected this model of maritime dominance. At its peak, the Royal Navy boasted more warships than the next 5 nations combined, a clear demonstration of naval supremacy. This formidable naval presence allowed Britain to control crucial trade choke points such as the Suez Canal, Gibraltar, Singapore, and the Straits of Malacca. Because these strategic locations were under British control, the pound sterling became the de facto global currency. Britain's naval power made it impossible to engage in international commerce without the pound, cementing its status. The United States later rose to similar heights after World War II, not solely through military strength, but by controlling worldwide trade infrastructure. The U.S. Navy, with its 11 aircraft carrier battle groups, more than the rest of the world combined, dominated every ocean. The country secured bases near all critical trade points, including Hormuz, the Straits of Malacca, Suez, Panama, and Bab el-Mandeb. This extensive maritime network was not just for defending American interests, but was fundamentally about controlling global commerce. It became impossible for international trade to function smoothly without American oversight, reinforcing the dollar's dominant position. This first stage, the military mastery over trade routes, was achieved by the United States in 1945 and remains intact today. Once that power is established, the pattern moves to the second stage, accumulating vast trade surpluses and, consequently, global wealth. When a nation controls critical trade routes, it begins to gather riches from the rest of the world not through theft, but through advantageous exchanges. Historically, Portugal exemplified this process. During the 16th century, Portugal ran enormous trade surpluses, importing spices, silk, and porcelain from Asia financed by gold and silver. In return, they exported European textiles, weapons, and African slaves, often at prices many times higher than their costs. These markups vastly favored Lisbon. As a result, Portuguese ships returned laden with Asian goods that could fetch 10 times what they had paid, fueling the city's wealth. This trade surplus made Lisbon one of Europe's wealthiest centers, with the Portuguese crown generating so much revenue that it could sustain government operations without heavily taxing the domestic population. The Dutch, in the 17th century, mastered this surplus-creating strategy even more systematically. Their Dutch East India Company became the wealthiest trading entity of its time, importing goods from Asia, the Americas, and Africa, and then selling them at a profit across Europe. They engaged in global arbitrage, buying low and selling high across different markets. This generated enormous wealth, transforming Amsterdam into a financial powerhouse with thriving canals lined with mansions and Dutch merchants who were among the richest in Europe. The pattern continued into the 19th century, when Britain's empire ran the largest trade surpluses in history to that point. British exports included manufactured goods, textiles, steel, and ships, which they sold worldwide, while importing raw materials such as cotton, tea, and rubber. London dictated the terms of trade, and its surplus wealth was reflected in the dominance of the British financial sector, which handled more capital than all of Europe combined. Post-World War II, the United States trade surplus was even more significant. Between 1945 and 1970, America exported machinery, automobiles, steel, and consumer goods globally. The dollar flooded into foreign central banks at a pace faster than they could reinvest it, causing U.S. gold reserves to swell. Over 20,000 tons at Fort Knox by the 1950s, more than the rest of the world combined. This stage, the wealth accumulation through advantageous trade, cemented the dollar's global reserve currency status, a position held from 1945 until the early 70s. However, this pattern is not destined to last forever. As history shows, nations tend to shift from producing and exporting wealth to consuming it. They move from running large surpluses to deficits, a process that signals the beginning of the third stage. At the peak of reserve currency status, a nation's currency is recognized and officially adopted as the global standard. Portugal's real was the dominant coin. The guilder became a preferred contract currency for the Dutch. Britain's pound was formally acknowledged after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and the dollar was officially established as the international reserve in 1944 at Bretton Woods. But this formalization signals the start of the decline because it marks the moment when the currency's power begins to weaken. Once a nation's currency is designated as the reserve, the country's dependence on its status grows, leading to a paradoxical outcome. To sustain confidence, the reserve nation often needs to run trade deficits, importing more than it exports, a phenomenon known as the Triffin dilemma. This creates a fundamental tension: the need to supply enough currency globally to meet demand, but doing so inherently weakens that currency's value over time. As the reserve nation accumulates deficits, the currency's credibility begins to diminish, and trust erodes in the currency's stability. When confidence falters, as it inevitably does, the fourth stage begins, living beyond one's means through deficit spending and currency debasement. Historically, this has been a slow but relentless process. Portugal in the 16th century started spending more than it earned, importing wealth from colonies and piling up debt, while its gold and silver reserves from Brazil and Africa financed lavish royal spending and military campaigns. They failed to recognize the impending decline because as long as gold kept flowing, they believed they could sustain their wealth. Similarly, the Dutch shifted from trade to finance, becoming a predominantly loan-based economy by the 18th century. Their wealth was invested in land, banks, and loans to other countries, rather than producing new wealth. Britain faced the same scenario in the early 20th century, relying on income from its colonies, investments, and imports, while its manufacturing sector waned. These nations, over time, began to sustain themselves by liquidating accumulated wealth rather than generating new economic vitality. The United States entered stage 4 in 1971 when it officially abandoned the gold standard, allowing the dollar to float freely. Since then, the dollar has been increasingly subject to inflationary pressures, a process called currency debasement, driven by massive money printing to finance deficits, wars, and welfare programs. Over recent years, the dollar has lost perhaps a quarter of its value, severely eroding savings, pensions, and purchasing power worldwide. When a nation lives beyond its means on a grand scale, its currency's credibility all but erodes, laying the groundwork for the next stage: loss of confidence. The sixth stage, the breaking point, arises when the trust in the reserve currency begins to unravel, prompting nations to seek alternatives. Historically, this has started with reserve divestment, countries and investors reducing their holdings and shifting towards other currencies, gold, or new financial arrangements. Portugal's real lost confidence in the 1600s. The Dutch guilder declined in the 18th century. Britain's pound saw its reserve status diminish after the Second World War as other countries moved into dollars and euros. Currently, the dollar is approaching this stage. Countries like China and Russia have been diversifying their holdings for years, buying gold in increasing quantities and reducing U.S. Treasury holdings. The BRICS nations are considering new currency arrangements, with discussions about a shared currency to replace or supplement the dollar. Some major oil producers, like Saudi Arabia, are beginning to accept yuan instead of dollars for oil sales to China, breaking the long-standing petrodollar tradition. The final stage, the collapse or replacement of the reserve currency, manifests in widespread adoption of a new monetary system. Unlike previous shifts, however, this transition will be more chaotic because the dollar is embedded deeply into every aspect of the global economy, from debt to commodities, trade to financial markets. There is no ready-made successor, and the scale of dollar-denominated debt, over $70 trillion, will cause defaults, banking crises, and systemic upheaval. Historically, new reserve currencies have replaced old ones gradually. The Spanish silver peso, the Dutch guilder, the British pound, and the American dollar, all replaced by the next in line after a period of volatility and market adjustments. In our interconnected world, the coming transition, driven by a combination of geopolitical shifts, economic imbalances, and systemic debt, will be tumultuous, unpredictable, and globally consequential. What this all means for you is straightforward. The days of trusting that your savings and assets retain their value without proactive management are numbered. As confidence wanes and the global pattern unfolds, it's vital to diversify assets, holding real estate, commodities, and productive businesses, those that can preserve value regardless of currency fluctuations. Just as merchants in history shifted their wealth from fading currencies to more stable ones, modern investors should heed these signals and prepare for a period of significant upheaval. If you understand this pattern now, you can position yourself to protect your wealth from the inevitable upheaval that is on the horizon. Amsterdam transformed into the world's sprawling warehouse, a vital hub where goods from Asia, the Americas, and Africa all converged. Dutch merchants didn't just engage in simple trade. They capitalized on subtle differences in markets across the globe, buying cheaply in one region and selling at a premium in another to reap the profit margin, a practice known today as arbitrage on an unprecedented scale. Their strategic positioning, coupled with relentless activity, resulted in an enormous trade surplus that filled the city's streets with wealth. Canals lined with opulent mansions served as windows into Amsterdam's prosperity, while merchants living luxuriously overshadowed many European monarchs in riches. In the 19th century, Britain set a new record, running the largest trade surplus the world had ever seen up to that point. The nation exported vast quantities of manufactured goods, textiles, steel, machinery, and ships to the rest of the world. Meanwhile, they imported raw materials like cotton, tea, and rubber, with prices and terms of trade carefully controlled by London. British economic dominance was reinforced by this advantageous exchange, which transformed Britain into the richest nation on earth. The city's financial district became a powerhouse, handling income and capital flows greater than the entire continent of Europe combined. Following World War II, from the year of 1945 to 1970, the United States experienced a remarkable trade surplus, the most dramatic in recorded history. As the sole major industrial power with its infrastructure still largely intact, America was exporting machinery, automobiles, steel, and consumer goods on a grand scale while Europe and Asia were mired in rebuilding. This excess of exports flooded foreign central banks with dollars, so many that the dollar's accumulation surpassed anything previously seen. U.S. gold reserves swelled as well. By the 1950s, Fort Knox held over 20,000 tons of gold, more than the rest of the world combined. This phase is recognized as Stage 2, a time of massive trade surpluses, where global wealth accumulated through strategic and advantageous exchanges. The dollar reigned supreme during this period, from 1945 to 1970. But as history demonstrates, this phase is finite. The pattern inevitably begins to shift. The country holding the reserve currency moves from a phase of energetic production and surplus to one of increasing consumption and deficit, shifting from exporting to importing, from building surpluses to running persistent deficits. This transition marks the onset of Stage 3, the formal recognition of reserve currency status, a tipping point. It's the moment when the world officially adopts a currency that has already become dominant in practice. Historically, this recognition has occurred at the peak of a currency's power. Portugal, for instance, had this moment in the early 1500s when European nations and Asian traders officially acknowledged the real as their primary medium of international exchange. Treaties specified transactions in reals, establishing the currency as the standard for global commerce. Mid-16th century saw the Dutch guilders become the preferred vessel for international trade, manifested through bills of exchange denominated in guilders. Even the British East India Company used guilders at times because Amsterdam boasted the most liquid financial markets of its era. Britain's official designation of the pound sterling as the international standard came during the Congress of Vienna in 1815, following the Napoleonic Wars. By then, treaties, loans, and commercial contracts across borders were denominated in pounds. The widespread adoption of the gold standard, which most nations embraced, was effectively a standard rooted in Britain's financial dominance, as the UK firmly controlled the rules governing international monetary exchanges. Finally, for the United States, the formal recognition of the dollar as the global reserve currency occurred at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. This event cemented the dollar's status, tying it to gold at a fixed rate and establishing institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to manage this new monetary paradigm. However, it's crucial to understand that this stage, formalization at the peak, is merely the culmination of a previous ascendancy, and it also sows the seeds for eventual decline. In 1944, a pivotal meeting took place in New Hampshire where 44 nations gathered to formalize a groundbreaking agreement. The United States dollar would serve as the world's official reserve currency. Under this arrangement, other currencies would peg their values to the dollar, which itself was initially pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. To oversee and manage this new international monetary system, institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were established, marking the most explicit and deliberate effort in history to formalize reserve currency status. However, what remains largely unspoken about the critical third stage of this cycle is that it represents the apex, arguably as good as it gets. When a currency attains reserve status and becomes the global standard, it unwittingly plants the seeds for its own downfall. Once a country's currency is globally needed more than the goods and services it produces, it tends to reduce production and become increasingly dependent on imports. As a result, the trade surplus, where exports exceeded imports, reverses into a persistent trade deficit. This shift is known as the Triffin dilemma, named after economist Robert Triffin, who articulated it in 1960. The dilemma states that for the global economy to have enough reserve dollars for trade and reserve holdings, the United States must continuously run trade deficits, sending dollars abroad. This necessity creates a paradox. Continually importing more than exporting undermines the dollar's value, which directly conflicts with its reserve currency role. It becomes mathematically impossible to maintain both a dominant reserve currency and a strong trade balance simultaneously. Consequently, once a currency reaches this pivotal third stage, it begins a slow descent into the fourth stage, characterized by deliberate deficit spending and living beyond its means. This fourth stage marks a point of no return. Here, the reserve country ceases to focus on generating wealth through production and instead relies heavily on consumption. Historically, Portugal exemplified this shift in the mid-16th century. The Portuguese nation's trade surplus dissolved, replaced by a dependence on importing goods such as Sicilian grains, Flemish textiles, and manufactured European products, financed by gold and silver extracted from Brazil and Africa. However, Portugal was no longer creating new wealth. It was merely spending the accumulated wealth of earlier years. The royal spending spree led to lavish palaces, churches, and military campaigns aimed at maintaining its empire. Yet, as long as Brazilian gold kept flowing into Portugal, officials remained oblivious to the danger. The flow of wealth seemed endless, but the gold wasn't infinite, and Portugal was not building productive assets, merely consuming. In the 18th century, the Dutch experienced a similar trajectory. After a century of impressive trade surpluses, they transitioned into being net importers. The wealth Amsterdam accumulated was enough for its citizens to enjoy comfort and luxury, leading many to prefer living off accumulated capital rather than engaging in productive trade or industry. The Dutch shifted their economic focus from trade and manufacturing to finance, becoming Europe's bankers, lending money to other nations rather than producing goods themselves. Over time, this passive income from finance replaced productive growth, and their trade balance reversed as they imported more than they exported. The wealth stored in Dutch assets was gradually liquidated to finance these deficits. Britain's experience in the early 20th century reflected the same pattern. By 1900, Britain was running significant trade deficits, importing food, raw materials, and manufactured goods at a growing rate, while its income from overseas investments, such as colonial assets, was diminishing in relative importance. The country's long-standing surplus had given way to a persistent deficit, and Britain was relying increasingly on the returns from its investments abroad to stay afloat. As these trends intensified, the historic cycle of decline became apparent, foreshadowing the broader systemic vulnerabilities that would emerge in the decades to come. For centuries, nations invested vast sums into railroads, mines, and countless enterprises across their empires. While these investments generated enormous income, they primarily extracted wealth that was created elsewhere, rather than fostering new prosperity within the homeland itself. British manufacturing, once the engine of the Industrial Revolution, declined steadily, with many factories either closing or falling behind competing industries in the United States and Germany. As a result, Britain's trade deficit widened year after year, a sign of living beyond its actual means, financing consumption by liquidating wealth accumulated in the past. This pattern persisted, and by 1971, the United States had entered what is known as Stage 4 of the reserve currency cycle, when the long-standing trade surplus reversed into a persistent deficit. Over the following decades, this deficit grew rapidly. By the 1980s, it was expanding at an alarming rate. When the 21st century arrived, the United States was running the largest trade deficit in history, approximately $800 billion annually. This meant the country imported far more goods than it exported, encompassing consumer electronics, automobiles, textiles, and countless other products from abroad. But how was this disparity financed? It was through the export of dollars, the printing of currency, and exchanging that currency for real goods and services. This arrangement became sustainable only because the dollar had established itself as the global reserve currency, a currency that other nations needed for their reserves, trade, and financial transactions. As a result, international markets accepted dollars, knowing that they would be in demand for trade and reserve holdings. Yet, at its core, this was essentially living beyond one's means, consuming more than producing, and it mirrors the pattern that has historically led to the collapse of every previous reserve currency. This brings us to Stage 5, currency debasement and mass money printing, desperate measures taken when deficits become unsustainable. When borrowing capacities are exhausted and it's no longer feasible to finance spending through traditional means, nations resort to devaluing their currency by printing additional money. A century and a half earlier, Portugal faced similar difficulties in the 1650s. With deficits mounting and trade revenues declining, Portuguese rulers began reducing silver content in their coins, thereby issuing more currency than the metal backing it could support. This process led to inflation, causing prices to rise and merchants to refuse reals, Portuguese silver coins, or demand more of them to trade for goods. Over time, the real's credibility eroded, and by the 1670s, international traders preferred other currencies. A comparable phenomenon occurred in the 1700s in the Netherlands. The Dutch guilder had previously been backed by a robust banking system and prudent monetary policies. However, as debts mounted, funding wars and maintaining colonies, they resorted to inflating the currency by printing more money. The value of the guilder declined, and by the 1800s, it was no longer the dominant international currency for trade. During the early 20th century, Britain's pound experienced the same decline, debased through 2 world wars. World War I forced Britain to print money and temporarily abandon the gold standard, which they attempted to re-adopt in 1925 at an overvalued rate, causing economic strain. The outbreak of World War II rendered Britain's monetary system entirely detached from gold, leading to the pound floating and steadily losing value. To rebuild and support the welfare state, Britain continued to print money, causing the pound to devalue repeatedly in 1949 and 1967, each devaluation further eroding global confidence. By the 1970s, the pound was no longer a reserve currency, but had become primarily regional. Similarly, the United States entered Stage 5 during the 21st century, a especially after the financial crisis of 2008. The Federal Reserve was compelled to print unprecedented amounts of money, a process known as quantitative easing, to stimulate the economy. This emergency measure involved creating trillions of dollars, which flooded into financial markets and the economy to stave off collapse. The pattern is clear. When deficits spiral beyond control and inflation accelerates, governments turn to currency debasement as a final effort to maintain stability, yet it sows the seeds of decline that follow history's well-worn cycle. Since the financial crisis of 2008, the Federal Reserve embarked on an unprecedented journey of monetary expansion, creating roughly $3.5 trillion through a process known as quantitative easing. Then, when the pandemic struck in 2020, the Fed printed an additional $7 trillion between 2020 and 22. This rapid expansion of the money supply occurred at a pace unmatched in American history outside of wartime. Such a move is a form of currency debasement, not by physically reducing the metal content in coins, like in centuries past, but by flooding the economy with fiat currency. The consequence is the same. The purchasing power of the dollar diminishes, and inflation begins to surge. In the years 2021 and 22, inflation reached levels unseen in 4 decades. The key difference from previous reserve currencies is the scale. Because the dollar is the dominant global reserve currency, every dollar printed by the Federal Reserve essentially exports inflation worldwide. Countries holding dollar reserves see the value of their holdings decline, and their dollar-denominated debts become easier to pay off, but their imports from America become more costly. This situation marks a critical juncture where confidence in the reserve currency starts to waver. When trust erodes, the transition to alternatives accelerates rapidly. This is the 6th stage in the historical collapse pattern. During this phase, nations begin seeking other assets or currencies to protect their reserves. History offers multiple examples. In the 1500s and 1600s, Portugal's confidence in its real currency waned in the 1700s, causing merchants to demand payment in Spanish silver or Venetian ducats instead of reals. Trade agreements started denominating transactions in other currencies, and merchants adjusted their practices, refusing or demanding more reals to compensate for debasement. By the time Spain annexed Portugal in 1580, the real was effectively obsolete as a reserve currency. The annexation simply confirmed what markets had already decided. Similarly, throughout the 1700s, the Dutch guilder lost credibility. European powers like France and Britain gradually moved their reserves into other currencies. By the 1700s, Amsterdam had relinquished its position as Europe's financial hub to London, which had become the continent's primary financial center. The guilder persisted in regional trade, but was no longer used for major international transactions. This shift took decades, but was ultimately irreversible. The British pound experienced a rapid decline in confidence after the Second World War. By 1945, Britain was saddled with enormous war debts to the United States and its allies. The pound was substantially overvalued and sustained mainly through American loans. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound by 30%, causing the value of holding pounds for international investors to plummet. Confidence in the currency collapsed overnight, prompting many nations to shift their reserves into the more stable dollar. By 1960, the pound's share of global reserves had fallen from over 60% in 1945 to less than 20%, completing the transition from pound to dollar within just 15 years. Today, the dollar appears to be at early stages of the 6th phase once again. Signs of this are evident everywhere. Starting in the 2010s, China and Russia gradually reduced their dollar reserves, shifting toward accumulating gold, buying thousands of tons, with China's official holdings more than doubling since 2008. Unofficial estimates suggest that China's actual gold reserves could be far higher. Similarly, after sanctions imposed in 2014, Russia liquidated nearly all its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds, signaling a move away from dependence on the dollar. These actions indicate that the world is already beginning to lose confidence in the dollar as the ultimate reserve asset. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have been actively exploring alternatives to the dollar for international trade. In 2023, they announced plans for a new BRICS currency. Although it hasn't been launched yet, the very fact that such discussions are underway is revealing of a significant shift. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia, which has been pricing oil exports in US dollars since 1974, the cornerstone of the petrodollar system, began accepting yuan for oil sales to China this year. This marks a break from a nearly 50-year-old precedent, signaling a changing landscape. Globally, central banks are diversifying their reserves away from the dollar. Since 2000, the dollar's share of global reserves has decreased from 72% to 58% in 2024, a decline of 14 percentage points. While seemingly small, this shift represents trillions of dollars moving out of dollar-denominated assets. The euro and gold have absorbed the majority of these reallocations. Even smaller nations are reducing their reliance on the dollar. Countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia are negotiating trade agreements to settle transactions in their own currencies rather than in dollars. This marks the beginning of what can be called Stage 6 of the pattern, the search for alternatives. This isn't driven by animosity toward America, but is instead a rational response to a historical pattern. All previous reserve currencies followed a similar trajectory, experiencing prolonged deficits, currency debasement, and a loss of purchasing power. These nations stop producing real wealth and shift towards consumption, borrowing, and currency degradation. Recognizing these signs, many countries are actively positioning their reserves and trade agreements to avoid being caught off guard when the inevitable transition occurs. Stage 7, the final phase, is the replacement and collapse of the old reserve currency. Instead of a formal decree, this shift occurs through market adoption. Traders and nations gradually cease using the old currency and switch to the new one simply because it becomes the most practical and accepted medium of exchange. Historically, the Portuguese real was replaced by the Spanish silver peso in the late 1500s. Spain's silver mines in the Americas, notably at Potosí in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico, produced more silver than the rest of the world combined, making Spanish coins standard in international trade. Their abundance, uniformity, and backing by continuous production made them superior. The Portuguese real, which was debased and weakened, couldn't compete and was progressively refused by merchants. The change took approximately 2 decades, and by the early 1600s, the real was virtually obsolete. Similarly, the Dutch guilder was succeeded by the British pound in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Britain's Industrial Revolution and naval dominance made the pound the natural successor. London's financial markets became deeper and more liquid than Amsterdam's, and Britain's command of trade power solidified its position. By the year 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, the pound was the undisputed global standard, while the guilder had become mainly regional. The British pound was eventually replaced by the dollar during the 1945 to 1960 period. This transition was formalized at the Bretton Woods Conference, but it took years to fully materialize. Post-World War II, Britain was economically drained and heavily indebted, whereas the United States held most of the world's gold reserves and retained an intact industrial base. The dollar grew dominant as the world's primary reserve currency, and Britain's pound gradually declined. By the year 1967, with the pound devalued again, it was evident that the dollar had fully replaced it. This historical pattern raises a pressing question today. What will succeed the dollar as the world's primary reserve currency? While the process is complex and ongoing, the lessons of history suggest that the next global reserve will emerge not through political mandates, but via market dynamics. When the old currency loses widespread trust and utility, nations and traders shift their reserves and transaction methods toward the new one, gradually, then suddenly. Currently, many nations and central banks are diversifying, signaling that we may be approaching the final act in this long-standing pattern of reserve currency evolution. The outcome remains uncertain because we are currently in Stage 6, the phase of actively searching for alternative currencies. However, history offers us valuable insights. The transition to a new reserve currency typically hinges on certain key factors: military dominance over critical trade routes, significant trade surpluses, and substantial productive capacity. Presently, no single nation embodies all these qualities simultaneously. China possesses a notable trade surplus and extensive production capabilities. Still, It lacks control over global trade routes through military power, which is crucial for establishing a dominant reserve currency. Furthermore, the Chinese yuan is not freely convertible. Strict capital controls prevent the currency from being fully used as a global reserve. To serve as the reserve currency, a nation must allow unprecedented freedom of capital movement across borders, something China currently restricts. The euro holds the position as the second most widely held reserve currency. Yet, Europe's internal cohesion faces significant challenges: an aging population, absence of a unified fiscal policy, and heavy reliance on external energy supplies. While Germany has notable industrial strength, southern European nations lack comparable production capacity. This results in a fragmented system that complicates the euro's potential to replace the dollar comprehensively. Gold is gaining renewed interest as a safe store of value. Central banks worldwide are acquiring more gold than they've done since the 1970s. Unlike fiat currencies, gold cannot be printed or debased. However, its physical limits prevent it from supporting the colossal volume of daily global trade, which runs into trillions of dollars. The amount of gold available in the world simply isn't enough to back such vast transactions comprehensively. Some analysts suggest that no single currency will emerge as a replacement. Instead, a basket of currencies, possibly managed by institutions like the International Monetary Fund, might become the standard. These special drawing rights, a compilation of multiple currencies, could serve as an alternative. Alternatively, technological innovation might introduce a new form of digital currency, perhaps backed by commodities or algorithms. While some believe cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin will replace traditional fiat money, governments are unlikely to relinquish control over their monetary systems voluntarily. Decentralized currencies threaten the sovereignty of existing financial regimes, making widespread acceptance by governments improbable in the near term. The most probable scenario involves a chaotic, protracted transition, a period marked by multiple regional currencies operating within different trade zones. In the Americas, the dollar would dominate. In Europe, the euro. In Asia, the yuan, with gold serving as a settlement medium between these blocks. This arrangement would be far from orderly, leading to increased volatility, instability, and economic hardship. Understanding this progression is crucial because it directly impacts individuals' financial security and survival. When reserve currencies falter, the repercussions extend beyond governments, devastating ordinary people's savings and wealth. For example, Portugal's financial collapse in the late 1500s triggered a depression across its empire. Merchants with holdings in the Portuguese real saw their wealth vanish. The Dutch economic decline in the 1700s devastated Amsterdam's middle class, as savings held in guilders depreciated and investments became worthless. Britain's post-World War II economic decline impoverished a whole generation. People with holdings in pounds, government bonds, and pensions suffered substantial losses as the currency devalued repeatedly. Today, the slow-motion devaluation of the American dollar is eroding individual wealth. Since 2020, the dollar has lost around a quarter of its purchasing power through inflation. If your savings, paycheck, or retirement account are denominated in dollars, they now buy 25% less than they did just a few years ago. This ongoing process illustrates the tangible, personal impact of currency decline, highlighting why understanding these patterns is critical for everyone's financial security. And this marks only the beginning of Stage 6. If history repeats itself, and the dollar follows the same decline pattern as previous reserve currencies, then the coming decade will witness an accelerative downturn. This will be characterized by rising inflation, further erosion of purchasing power, and more countries abandoning the dollar as their reserve asset. When ultimately Stage 7 arrives, signaling the replacement, the global economy will face a collapse, a severe currency crisis. The dollar could lose as much as half its value in just a few months, a scenario similar to what occurred to the British pound in 1949. Such a collapse could, theoretically, happen to the dollar as well. So what steps should one take in response? First and foremost, recognize that holding large amounts of dollars is a risk, not a safe haven. The dollar is gradually losing its reserve status, and this process is now speeding up. Instead of concentrating your wealth solely in dollar-denominated assets, Diversify across different types of assets that can retain their value across currencies. Real estate, productive businesses, and commodities are suitable options because their worth tends to remain stable regardless of fluctuations in any single currency. Secondly, keep a close eye on indicators that signal stage 6 is unfolding. Monitor central bank reserve data. If you observe a steady and accelerating reduction in dollar reserves held worldwide, that confirms the transition is gathering speed. Observe shifts in trade agreements as well. If major economies begin conducting more trade in other currencies, that's a clear sign of the process. Gold prices are another crucial indicator. If gold prices surge, this often indicates that global investors are fleeing fiat currencies in general, seeking refuge in tangible assets. Third, understand that these trends are rooted in mathematics, not politics. It's irrelevant whether you support or oppose American policies. The same fundamental financial principles, what destroyed the real, the guilder, and the pound, are at work here. Every reserve currency has gone through the same 7 stages, and currently, the dollar is in stage 5, heading into stage 6. This pattern is indifferent to notions of exceptionalism or military might. It hinges on core economic factors like deficits, debt, and currency debasement. On all these counts, the United States is following this destructive script. Allow me to share something that should alarm you. Historically, reserve currencies have lasted roughly between 80 and 110 years. The Portuguese real had an 80-year run from 1545 to 1530. The Dutch guilder lasted about 80 years from 1640 to 1720, and the British pound served as a reserve for just over 100 years, from 1850 to 1920. The American dollar achieved reserve status in 1944, which means it has now been in its role for about 81 years. When compared to previous patterns, we are right at the typical lifespan. Yet, every symptom of late-stage decline is evident. Soaring deficits, currency debasement, waning confidence, and an active search for alternatives. The pattern points toward what's next, stage 7, replacement. But what makes this period unique is the scope of the collapse. Unlike previous reserve currency failures, which were largely regional, affecting only Portugal and its trading partners, or the Netherlands and Northern Europe, or Britain and the Commonwealth, the forthcoming dollar collapse will be a global phenomenon. The dollar isn't simply embedded within one nation's economy. It is woven into every sector, every economy, every central bank, every trade transaction, and every commodity price, from oil and gold to wheat. When the dollar loses its reserve status, the effects will ripple worldwide, creating chaos across all economies, destabilizing markets on an unprecedented scale. When a currency is the world's reserve, virtually everything in the global economy is priced in it. Once the dollar loses this status, no sector or market remains unaffected because it is deeply embedded in international trade, finance, and commodities. This transition promises to be far more tumultuous than any previous currency shift, primarily because there's no ready-made substitute capable of instantly replacing the dollar's central role. The sheer magnitude of dollar-denominated debt, more than $70 trillion in bonds alone, means that a collapse could trigger defaults on a global scale, impacting every continent. Countries with emerging markets that have borrowed in dollars will find themselves unable to meet their repayment obligations, leading to widespread financial distress. Major corporations that have issued dollar bonds could face bankruptcy, and even nations with significant dollar reserves, such as advanced economies, may see their central bank balance sheets severely damaged or even implode. The systemic risk involved in this process is exponentially greater than what occurred in 1949 when the pound sterling fell, or in 1780 when the Dutch gulden underwent its collapse. This isn't merely a shift in currency. It's a comprehensive upheaval and reorganization of the entire international financial architecture. Such reconfigurations are inherently disorderly, often accompanied by pain, chaos, and the erosion of accumulated wealth. To be absolutely clear, I'm not claiming the dollar will fall tomorrow. I am not asserting that the United States will become a failed state overnight. Nor am I suggesting that there's cause for panic or that everyone should sell their holdings immediately. What I am emphasizing is that this pattern, seen over centuries, continues to manifest. It involves 7 identifiable stages, with 4 past examples, and currently, The dollar is in stage 5, progressing into stage 6. The timeline suggests that we could see the culmination, stage 7, within the next 10 to 20 years, potentially sooner if the transition accelerates, or perhaps later if the U.S. manages to break the cycle. However, breaking this historical pattern would require extraordinary measures that no previous reserve currency has managed to achieve. It would mean reversing mounting deficits, halting the relentless money printing, and rebuilding genuine productive capacity. These are not simple policy decisions. They are politically near impossible because they demand short-term sacrifices in exchange for long-term stability. Democratic systems tend to reject pain and prefer stimulus, easy money, and short-term comfort, making such reforms unlikely. As the pattern continues and stage 6 begins to unfold more rapidly, those who understand these dynamics can and should prepare accordingly. That means diversifying away from solely dollar-based assets, accumulating tangible resources, and closely monitoring key indicators. When stage 7 eventually arrives and a new reserve currency takes its place, those who are well prepared will hold assets that retain value across currencies, rather than being trapped in a collapsing dollar. Historically, when Portugal faced a decline in its real, merchants shifted to Spanish silver. Dutch bankers moved their wealth to London when the guilder lost standing. And after World War II, Britain's elite transferred their wealth into dollars and dollar assets. Today, savvy investors and institutions are doing much the same, steadily, systematically, and quietly over time. This pattern of currency decline and replacement isn't driven by conspiracy theories. It's a well-documented historical cycle stretching across 6 centuries for currencies and now a 5th. The crucial question is whether you will recognize these signs before the final transition occurs or find yourself as part of the liquidity that unwittingly transfers wealth to those who anticipate it. The pattern is unmistakably laid out, and the timeline is clearly visible. Currently, the dollar sits in stage 5, and historical trends indicate that stage 6 and stage 7 are not merely possibilities but highly probable outcomes, almost certain. This is the typical way reserve currencies come to an end, not through invasions or disasters, but through a process dictated by mathematics itself, starting slowly, then accelerating rapidly. At first, the decline is subtle and overlooked. Eventually, it becomes impossible to ignore. By the time the majority of people realize what is happening, the transition to a new system has already been completed. Recognizing this pattern changes your perspective on the dollar, the global economy, and the future. Throughout history, this cycle has repeated itself 4 times over the span of around 80 to 110 years, involving 7 distinct stages. Now, that cycle is playing out once more, right now. Being aware of these stages allows you to monitor the unfolding situation. Following this understanding won't prevent the inevitable, but it might shield you from the destruction that often accompanies such transitions. Knowing the pattern empowers you to prepare and survive through the chaos.